So here we are, chapter 29 of the story. We're nearly finished, just 2 more weeks, and we've travelled through God's story together. We began in creation, and here we are just 2 weeks away from having journeyed this whole story together. I just trust that God has been speaking to your heart as you've looked at the bigger picture of what God is doing in the world. I know that every time I revisit this big picture, God speaks to me and I see new things, and I've been encouraged. I hope you have too. So tell me, how was chapter 29? I know it was a long read. It was an exhausting read, because when I read about Paul and his missionary journeys, it's almost overwhelming that one man could travel so far over an 8 to 10 year period and share the good news of Jesus with so many people. It almost leaves me feeling exhausted. Certainly leaves me thinking, wow, what a man was Paul. And there is no doubt that Paul was God's man, raised up at a particular time in history with a particular job to do. And throughout history, we've seen that God does that. He will raise up a man or a woman for a particular season with a particular job to do. But at the same time, as we read Paul's missionary journeys, I think there's a lot that we can learn about our mission, the way the mission of God is meant to be working out in the world. And so as we focus on chapter 29 this morning, I just want to touch on a few points and ask the question, what is the Spirit of God saying to you? What is the Spirit of God saying to me? What is the Spirit of God saying to us as his family together, as his church at Holdfast? You know what I love about Paul's missionary journeys is the whole thing seems to begin with God's people in worship. We have this group of people gathering together, worshipping and praying, whatever that looked like. And as they worship and pray, the Spirit of God speaks to them. And the Spirit of God says, set aside Paul and Barnabas and send them off on mission. And so they do. Right there in church, it looks like they lay hands on Paul and Barnabas and they send them off. Could you imagine if church was like that? What would it be like to come to church expecting that somebody's life might change that morning? What would it be like coming to church if you knew there was the possibility that the Spirit of God might speak, and led by the Spirit, the people of God might say to you, they might say to me, Stephen, I want you to leave where you are, where you're comfortable, and I want you to go to this different place and do a work for God there. What if he said to you in church, I want you to leave where you are and go to another place? What if he said, I want you to sell this possession and use the money to support this cause? What would church look like if that sort of thing were going on? If we were expecting the Spirit of God to speak to us and to tell us what we ought to be doing with our lives? Imagine if church were like that. Would you be excited to go to church? Maybe like me, I think I'd even be a little scared. But it would be good. It would be exciting. It would be worth getting out of bed for on a Sunday morning, wouldn't it? And so Paul makes these 3 missionary journeys, hundreds of miles over 8 or 10 years. But as you read these journeys, as you look at them on a map, and we don't have a map today, but you can find a map and put some pins in it if you want to, you could almost see that there's a strategy behind this whole thing. It's like Paul has sat down and said, what are the most strategic places I can go to for the spread of the gospel? And so what we see is Paul visits the cultural centres of the world. He goes from city to city where he knows the influential people will be gathered, and there he preaches the good news of Jesus. And it's like Paul has strategically said, what's the best way to get this gospel out? And this is the strategy that Paul uses. He goes to the cultural centres where people are gathered, the leadership people are gathered, and he shares with them the good news of Jesus, knowing that from there people will go out back to their towns and their villages, and they will share the good news of Jesus. And the people that hear the good news of Jesus will share the good news of Jesus. Paul makes disciples who will make disciples who will make disciples. Does that surprise you? It shouldn't, because we know that that's God's plan. That was Jesus' commission, wasn't it? Go out and make disciples. Which always leaves me a little uneased, really. a little unnerved. So I know some of you listened to Francis Chan last week. Francis Chan asked those confronting questions. Well, how many disciples have you made? How many people have you baptized? How many people have you taught to obey everything I commanded them? You know, how many people have you taught to live as citizens of God's kingdom? And I think as we read the journeys of Paul, we're reminded of the commission of Jesus, and we're reminded of our life's purpose, which is to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. So Paul's first missionary journey begins in prayer and sending off of Paul and Barnabas. His second missionary journey is interesting because it begins with an argument. Paul and Barnabas can't agree on the staff team that ought to carry out this job. And it was a messy argument. It was an ugly argument, really. In fact, it ended up with Paul and Barnabas parting ways. Now, Paul and Barnabas, let's not get this wrong, Paul and Barnabas loved each other, but at this point in time, they just could not agree. So what did they do? Well, let me tell you what I've seen happen in churches again and again and again when people disagree. When one person thinks the mission should go this way and another person thinks the mission should go this way, do you know what generally happens in the churches I've seen? Because we don't like to disagree, and because we know how much we should love each other, we do nothing at all. And because of our arguments, because of our incapacity to get beyond our disagreements, often the mission of God is thwarted. The mission of God stands still. But Paul and Barnabas, they had this big argument. It was a blow-up, and they chose to part ways. They said, we can't work together at this point of time. But you know what happened? Paul went one way. In fact, Paul found a young man, Timothy, and blessed Timothy and trained up Timothy as another great gospel worker. And then Barnabas went this other way, and he kept training up a young man called John Mark. And so out of this argument, it was like they split, and the mission went in two directions, and the mission continued to grow. And I wonder, maybe we need to learn, maybe our differences need to be used for the good of God's kingdom. Maybe we need to get beyond our differences and see that the mission has to come first. Even when we disagree, even when we need to part company, the mission comes first. And then we have Paul's third missionary journey, and it's just hundreds of miles crammed into a few verses. But what we see in the third missionary journey is we see Paul's heart to revisit the churches he's planted on his earlier trips. And so he revisits those churches, and his heart is to develop leaders. Leaders who will develop leaders who will develop leaders so that the work continues. And again we have this theme, disciples who make disciples who make disciples, because that is God's plan. That is God's only plan. Disciples who make disciples who make disciples. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? I could share more thoughts this morning. I could share some important questions that I have for me. But really, the most important thing today is not what I think. It's not what Stephen thinks. The important question today is, what is the Spirit of God saying to you? What is the Spirit of God saying to me? And what is the Spirit of God saying to us as a church family? As we push forward in God's mission together, what is the Spirit of God saying to us? What is He wanting us to learn from the missions of Paul? Are you open to hear the Spirit of God speaking to you today? What is He saying? Will you share that with somebody?